Yeah, well, I mean, the first thing I'll say is that Gandalf's not real and black magic doesn't really exist. So, at the end of the day, people have looked at additive and they've thought, well, gosh, this is a magic box. And if I just have the right Gandalf standing in front of this magic box, then I can get any part off the bed or any part out of the vat, whatever the process might be, any part out of the powder. And that part's like ready to go, like plug it into, to the downstream process or to the next component, or whatever. That's not true. It's just not true.
Welcome to the Additive Advantage podcast. I'm Danny Mason, joined by Sean Anderson. This is where additive manufacturing meets accountability, and where we talk about turning pilots into production and ideas into outcomes. Let's jump in.
Join us for an incredible conversation with Blake Teipel, former CEO of Ascentium, and more recently, a leader at Nexa 3D following their acquisition. It's a name many of you, I'm sure, will recognize from the last wave of additive industry growth and excitement. Blake brings a rare manufacturing first perspective with some of his background at places like John Deere. It's shaped by his time there, but also combined with deep experience and expertise in the additive space from a material science perspective, and then launching a company and dealing with the excitement and challenges of building that in his days at Ascentium. At this point, he's stepped out into a different industry, launching another company, again, leading and doing challenging things around technology. But he's had an opportunity to step back and take a clear-eyed view of what worked, what some of the structural challenges were in the industry, and what it'll take for additive to deliver real results going forward. So I'm looking forward to hearing Blake's perspective, and I know that there will be some concrete takeaways in there for everyone. I am pumped this morning to have Blake Teipel join me. Many of you in the additive industry will recognize the face and the name. Blake has led a number of efforts in the additive space, from all the way back in the R&D lab level at Texas A&M to starting a company, launching a company, and fighting the good fight in the additive industry. Blake, instead of the intro that I gave, what would you want our listeners to know about you?
Thanks, Sean. Delighted to be here and just sort of been out of the space for a couple of years. So it's exciting to come back. I mean, look, I came into the additive industry with sort of two different sets of background. One was in manufacturing. I had worked at John Deere and at Caterpillar prior to joining additive. And then also with material science, I'd studied material science and nanocomposites and nanotechnologies. So the idea was, man, how can we in the additive space, try to make additive manufacturing more, industrially relevant? That was the clarion call, and that was why we got involved. So worked on that for a number of years, and it was a great ride. We had our ups, we had our downs, and it was a great ride. So excited to talk about it.
Well, I think after a couple of years out of the space, you'll have an interesting perspective. Obviously, still involved in starting companies and launching businesses and technology, but I suspect maybe some things that you'll see clearly today that might not have been as clear when you lived in the jungle that we wake up in every day. And that's really where I'd like to start, if it's okay, Blake. I'd love to know if you could share some perspective and some lessons learned seeing the evolution of the whole industry over the last 5 years. Some of that when you were in the thick of it, some of that now that you've been out of it for a couple of years. Share some of that perspective with us.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, look, so just to kind of refresh where we came from. So we had grown our business. We went up through, a few rounds of venture capital. We did a Series A, did a Series B. And then, like several other companies, we endeavored upon the public markets through a SPAC IPO process. And that was in calendar year 2021. So if you sort of think about kind of what was happening in the space, there was the pandemic, and this was, kind of the second year. And this was a lot of the sort of the initial chaos of the pandemic, I think, brought everybody together because it was a common, threat vector, and it was a common unknown. And then that was sort of 2020, right, in the United States, right? And, we had grown our business. We had started working with the federal government. We had worked with the state government in Texas, the Texas Military Department in those years. We had worked with the Air Force and the Air National Guard, and so on. That was some great work that our team was able to get started even during that initial period of chaos. That led to a lot of our growth. Then in 2021, there was a lot of money that was kind of on the sidelines. I call it sort of like the outside money, and taking a look at, maybe coming into the additive space, and maybe there's a true growth vector for the adoption of additive manufacturing in industrial contexts, right? You had sort of Desktop Metal had done their SPAC IPO. Mark Forged had announced their SPAC IPO. Nano Dimension, in fact, people forget, but Nano Dimension, in fact, led the pack and had the first SPAC IPO in the summer of 2020. And then, of course, there was Velo 3D, and then of course there was us. And so, there were all of these companies, many of whom very early stage, many of whom, were trying to catch up to the what people have, sometimes called sort of the old guard companies in Stratasys and in 3D Systems and Materialize and, many others. And so there was all of this sort of excitement and all this sort of hype. And there was another whole hype cycle that was going on. It was a very, dynamic moment in the industry, 2020, 2021. And so then, we went on this back journey. Unfortunately, we had to withdraw our transaction. We were not able to complete. We were not able to list. And so then we went through, kind of a period of restructure and retrench. And then eventually we sold our business to, Nexa 3D. And that was that deal was completed in January of 2024. So that's kind of just the Sentium thumbnail sketch, in high level terms across that period. So then I worked, at Nexa 3D for a little while. And then I had been interested in AI, and I sort of took an opportunity to sort of look at AI companies, which, we could chat about if you want. But as I've had a chance, Sean, getting at your question here, as I've had a chance to sort of step back and think about the additive industry over the last 5 years, if you sort of think about the turmoil and the churn and all of the operating environment features that the space has had to navigate, it has just been an incredibly dynamic, difficult, challenging, and in some cases, tragic time for additive manufacturing companies. I think we can say that because all those SPAC companies that I mentioned, us included, have come on hard times or, had to do a series of painful things because the growth expectations that everybody had, the outside money, us in the executive suite, the boardroom, the investors, none of that materialized for really anybody. And so, I think there are a lot of reasons for that, but certainly, again, getting at your question here, the turmoil, the tariffs, the pandemic, and sort of all of these macroeconomic factors, high interest rates after historically low interest rates, historically high inflation, economic uncertainty, foreign wars, like it has just been a moment in the world. So then you think about this sort of burgeoning, domain, this burgeoning sector, which is additive. I mean, additive at one point was sort of a $15 billion industry, things that I've seen place it, but, 9 to 10 billion, maybe growing its way out of that. I haven't looked at some of the reports most recently, so I might be a little bit out of date there. But then if you look at, large companies like Nike, I mean, Nike's a $40 billion company, the auto companies are much. So this is an industry that is, a third the size or a fourth the size of many of the large cap single companies, right? So, and that's after the industry being in its present form for, 40 years since the late 80s, right? So you sort of think about all that and man, additive has a tremendous amount of promise, a tremendous amount of potential. But man, how do you create real, sustainable, durable value in the space in the presence of all of this uncertainty? That has been, I think, to my eye at least, the single greatest challenge for this sector to try to navigate over the last 5 years.
Well, there's a lot to unpack there. You shared some themes that we've heard from some of the other folks that we've had on the podcast. One of them that I'd like to get your take on is came from this John Deere background, this manufacturing background. You understand the pace at which that changes. And then you also lived as a CEO, this experience of raising VC money and other investors' concepts of the pace of change and growth expectations. Talk to me a little bit about how you match sources of money with strategy and customer expectations, short, mid, and long term. And what do you see? What lessons can we take away as an industry about how to actually deliver on that potential going forward from a sources of growth capital and customer expectation standpoint?
Yeah. So you sort of have three main players here, three main stakeholders in this conversation. You've got the customer, the investor, and basically the additive company, right? Those are sort of the three sort of main stakeholders in this ecosystem. The customer and the investor actually have some of the same expectations. That is to say, they both want value delivery and they want it tomorrow or today. Like tomorrow is actually a little bit too late for the value delivery for both the investor and for the customer. And the investor sort of imagines that they have, if it's a venture investor, they sort of imagine they have a multi-year cycle between deployment and harvest. Some funds, if they deploy capital closer to harvest, then they're under pressure from their LPs to get that money returned and then recycled back into the fund. So there are these weird layers of, kind of requirement or expectation. Some is stated expectation. Much of it is not stated expectation. And then the operators, which are kind of in the middle here between sort of the money and sort of the paying customer, those operators are trying to deliver the expectations on both sides. But the operators are the ones that realize, hey, look, when the operator is an additive company, usually you've got that paying customer that has to adopt. They don't just have to adopt a technology for a piece or for a component or a new piece that goes into a widget. They've got to adopt a new supplier, a new buying habit. They have to think about modeling the pricing differently because procurement folks inside of organizations, usually part of their compensation is tied to how many fewer part numbers they can bring on, how many fewer new suppliers they can add to the supply base. And they're looking at cost parity for, a widget produced conventionally to a widget produced in any new method, whether the new method is additive or anything else. And so you've got all these complicated buying hurdles that you have to overcome as an additive company. And all the while, the investors are saying, well, wait a minute, what about the growth? Investors are looking at deployment strategies. Even if they've got hardware deployment strategies, they're comparing time to recycling capital. How long do I have to let this money sit out there? And, what might my quantum be to get that capital returned into my fund and into my, and they're looking for 100x or 1000x. I mean, if you're an early stage VC, if you're later stage, maybe you have longer time horizons, but usually the additive companies aren't large enough to be able to attract the attention of these later stage VCs. So usually you've got an earlier stage fund because the additive company is small, because the industry is small. That $15 billion number I cited earlier, those of you who follow like Andreessen Horowitz, they just raised a $15 billion fund. This is one fund at one company that is deploying capital across a variety of strategies and across a variety of spaces. I mean, A16Z, they're one of the most, sort of well-known VCs out there. And one fund that they raise is $15 billion. Again, a single pool of capital larger than the entire industry, right? So additive is just in this funny space where it is incredibly challenging to match the growth curve of your company with the harvest cycle of a VC, with the adoption rate of anything at scale, whether it's hearing aids or dental aligners or shoes or industrial components. It's really hard to match up those three sets of underlying expectations. Really challenging.
So I agree 100%. And you said a couple things that I want to touch on. One of them, what do we do with that? And Blake, if you had a magic wand, because everybody loves these questions, right? If you had a magic wand and you could start fresh, knowing what you know today, how would you put together a mix that matches customer expectations, investor expectations, and frankly, company and I want to include employees in there as well? Because one of the things that has been challenging for me working in this industry is anytime you have turmoil with companies, at the end of the day, it affects people. And I've had multiple people from my previous life reach out to me and say, hey, wow, additive manufacturing looks like your industry is, just ready to explode and so on and so forth. Do you think I ought to consider jumping into that? And I'm like, well,
Additive's been ready to explode since 24.
Right. Well, it's been exploding, just not always in a good way. But talk to me about how would you structure that today if you could, knowing what you know, go back and do it all over? What would the recipe be?
Yeah, that's great, Sean. I think the most successful opportunity sets in the space, kind of like next 5 years, involve taking some of the technology usage risk off the table for the customer. So if you think about the things that the customers have to do, and we walk through this quite a lot with people in, especially the Air National Guard, for example, I'll just kind of highlight that. There were a lot of people that were already 3D printing inside the Air Force. The Air Force has a very robust 3D printing group headed by incredibly intelligent folks. They're putting out, in some cases, incredible parts. The Air Force can be credited actually with sort of helping to push a lot of the growth in additive historically. I mean, look back at the Fortis 900 systems, that were co-developed in many ways between, people that fly planes and the systems producers and all that. But the reality was what we had to do at Ascentium was we had to help train these new users of our additive system, our additive flavor. And that's a common theme that I saw also even at Nexa 3D. There was a constant training requirement for people to use, photo printing on the Nexa flavor, even if they were familiar with other flavor. The point there is that whenever you ask a customer to have to learn something new while the customer is also under pressure to produce the component, that's a huge challenge. And the customer believes they can take the challenge on, and many customers can, but many customers can't. They don't understand all of the ins and outs. I mean, if somebody calls in sick, at the site, and then there's going to be a trainer that's coming to the site that day, training has to be rescheduled, and usually it's 2 weeks to 4 weeks out. There's just all these concatenating delays. So what I think the good plays are going forward rest largely on a service component where there's a really great company that happens to use additive manufacturing to produce solutions for its customers. And so the additive company retains that know-how, that intellectual property, the trade secret awareness, all of that around how to produce great parts. So that's an advantage, an enduring advantage for the additive company. And then the secondary advantage is the additive company is selling the actual component, just like a machine shop or a sheet metal shop or an injection molding house would sell a component into a value chain. The beautiful thing about that is that everybody kind of knows how to buy a single component on the customer side, whether it's using automotive, like a tier one, tier two, or the OEM themselves. They know how to think about buying components. And usually where additive really wins then is in providing these smaller sets of components. And the pricing then on parity can compete and can win when it's an additive part produced at 100 pieces or 1,000 pieces versus the tooling and molding costs in some cases of parts produced at 100 or 1,000 pieces for these limited runs. So there are ways that additive can really win. I just think the classic model over the last 5 years of companies like ours and others that sold a machine and then tried to sell the materials, so sort of the razor blade, that was a played out playbook, man. And there are so few industrial buyers that can buy the razor and then, afford to use it 24/7. So they're buying a lot of razor blades to support that business model at scale for the additive company. So it's kind of just a mismatch at the end of the day, despite the fact that a lot of these customers think they can do it. And they're like, well, I buy a CNC mill, I buy an injection molding machine. I'm used to capital equipment. Yes, you are. But when you buy a mill or a molding machine, you have an entire supply base for the materials that flow through that machine. And you've got an entire supply base of employees. You talked about the employees, John, the employees that know how to run the mill and the molding machine, and they know how to buy these materials. They know how to qualify materials. That, awareness, that's sort of like industrial knowledge. The kids these days, they call it the lore. The lore is not there for additive. It's not there yet. And so, you have to sort of operate differently. The employees are such an important piece and they get overlooked everywhere, and it's tragic. And my heart breaks for all the stories that you hear, including some of the stories that, we were part of. I mean, everybody kind of thought growth was going to happen in a certain rate, and it didn't happen. And so staffing up, staffing down, if you can instead think about your additive company that has cutting edge tech, but think about it like your grandfather's company that needs to move slow and steady and grow at a slow and steady pace. It really is a sort of, tortoise beats the hare analogy here to make a sustainable and a healthy additive company. And that's great for the employees. It's great for the customers. Ultimately, it's great for the right investors that have the right, recovery horizons. But, grow fast, break glass. That's a tough message for additive, I think.
Yeah, it's tough when you have a customer base that's fundamentally it's not their DNA. Manufacturing does not adopt the shiniest, newest thing at lightning speed. I'm curious. So you're talking about develop the lore and get good around using the tech, serving the right applications. How would you capitalize that company that you're putting together here?
I would capitalize it very judiciously. It's almost an anti VC message, although I will say it's interesting. And even in my current company, there are a lot of VCs now that are talking about the new phrase, default alive, which is profitability, right? Like it's so funny, the vernacular. So yeah, I would capitalize a business in the additive space, with very careful money. And what I just mean by maybe it's VC, maybe there's a fund that's like, hey, we're writing checks and we really don't need this money back for 10 years. That could be a great financial partner. Otherwise though, if you could capitalize it on a low and slow capital partner, that would be a capital partner that I think probably has the right risk tolerance and recovery profiles to match the inevitable slog that it's going to be to grow a manufacturing based company.
Yeah. Agreed. It's tricky to find, I think when interest rates were really low, it was easier because when you think low and slow, you're talking about bank-ish,
Mm-hmm.
thinking. You're not talking about VC private equity type thinking there. Was a little easier when rates are low, has gotten trickier, not impossible, but, to your point, The hard part as the operator or the executive is, particularly during a hype cycle, what I saw is, man, if your chart doesn't have a certain slope, they don't even want to talk to you. And
That's right.
you and I, we knew each other during that time and
That's
talked
right.
about, well, do you want to get in the room with a graph that gets you in the door, but probably isn't possible to deliver? Or do you want to be stuck out in the hall with a graph that you might actually be able to deliver, but nobody in that room is interested in? And of course, the sales 101 is like, well, go stand outside a different room. And, there's um, one of the lessons I've learned from that is that the only reliable money is customer money. Now,
Yeah.
it's tough when you're building from scratch to do that purely with customer money. But at the end of the day, it's the money that is true in motivation. You touched on another thing that I want to go back to when you talked about the hardware element. And, we've seen this kind of the pendulum swing back and forth in additive. Once upon a time, oh my gosh, the coolest thing in the world was hardware. And then it was, oh my gosh, if everybody could just be a materials company because that's where the gravy is. And then all those companies went under. Or, the big ones that were in it spun those business units off. And frankly, some of them shortly after they were spun off, they went under. And everybody's like, wait a minute, I thought we all wanted to be materials companies. And then you've got, well, wait, what if we could just be a software company and instead of building this stuff and shipping it, the customer could just download our product? I have a good friend here in South Dakota who runs a software company, and I always give him a hard time about how much harder my job is because my customers can't just click a button and get my product. And of course, he has witty comebacks for that. Maybe we'll get him on here one of these days. But you bring up some great points around applications, around
Yeah.
the knowledge required to actually make additive work there. But at the end of the day, the parts still have to come off of something. How do again, based on your perspective and experience, how could or should hardware fit into the strategy of this company that, you and your magic wand are putting together? How do you build that in knowing that it does make it more complicated? It does make your development process longer, but at the end of the day, the parts have to come off of something. Give me some perspective on that.
Yeah, I mean, there are, I think there are great examples of companies right now that are really, really great at using hardware. And some of that hardware that they use is their own. Some of that hardware is the hardware of others. I'm thinking about, companies. There's one called Cubes that is deploying, server rack type deployments of, FDM type machines, and that's that's a playbook that's been on a rinse and repeat. There's a lot of operating flexibility there that the cubes in this example can retain themselves, react to a machine that might go down or a machine that comes open or a print job that succeeds, print job that fails, and so using hardware is vital to get the component. It is, but I think this sort of like mixed footprint is a really good approach. There was a company that I loved working with. It was a company called CAM. This was Kozlowski Advanced Manufacturing out in, the Carolinas. Brad Kozlowski, people know, he's a NASCAR racer. And I really liked the guy, getting to know him just a tiny bit. Getting to know him and his vision for his company. His company was a manufacturing company, and they were focused on high spec parts. And the high spec parts usually would use additive to create the preform of the component. And then that preform would go over to a mill and get finished on the mill. It would use fixtures and jigs for their mill operation that usually were printed. You kind of had this, a true sort of industrial high flexibility to, environment like Kozlowski was in those days. You had to have, this sort of hybrid hardware footprint, additive, subtractive. They had a really nice, inspection lab with CMM and microscopy and particle analysis and all that stuff. And credit to Brad, man, he knew all this stuff very, very well himself, even though his day job's driving race cars. So you kind of can see there's these two different possible, paths that could win and have a right to win. And sort of, again, one is the sort of like server bank, deployment, which we've seen wins. And so early on, you had like kind of the Ultimakers, right? This was sort of the first, wave of these sort of server bank FDM deployments, and they were printing flexible parts, fixtures and jigs for tooling and footwear and all the rest. Then you had the Ultimakers that got disrupted by Prusa, because Prusa was lower cost and could basically do the same thing. And then Prusa's gotten disrupted by Bamboo Labs. So it's just hardware. The illustration there is that like hardware continues to travel down to a near zero cost, especially when you've got foreign state actors that are pumping money in strategic ways like we see. So hardware's tough. It is really, really tough. My current business has a software component, and a services component, and no hardware component. So, pick your headache, right?
Yep.
The hardware comes a lot of them.
Yep. So if I ask you to shift gears a little bit from that, hey, I'm going to build a company based on lessons learned. If you shift gears to say, I'm going to give some advice to companies who are looking to leverage additive to improve their business, but again, relying on all that experience and perspective, what would your charge be? Because despite the ups and downs of the industry, almost every company on the planet is still trying to figure out how to leverage additive and get real value. What would your advice be to those companies as they think about how much they bring in-house, how much they don't, how deep they go, how fast they go, who they go with? Give us your thoughts.
Yeah, well, I mean, the first thing I'll say is that Gandalf's not real and black magic doesn't really exist. So, at the end of the day, people have looked at additive and they've thought, well, gosh, this is a magic box. And if I just have the right Gandalf standing in front of this magic box, then I can get any part off the bed or any part out of the vat, whatever the process might be, any part out of the powder. And that part's like ready to go, like plug it into, to the downstream process or to the next component, or whatever. That's not true. It's just not true. And people get, you sort of hear these stories about these manufacturing vice presidents at large orgs. They walk a trade show floor at Additive and they see all these beautiful parts that are on the bench at a trade show. And then they see the equipment sitting, kind of behind in the same booth. And they're like, oh, I must get that equipment and then I'm going to get these parts. And you can get those parts with that equipment, but you need like a bunch of other stuff, polishers and deburring machines and support material removal and CMMs and a mill to put sealing surface in threads and other things if it's a metal part. So like my advice would simply be, reject any message that says that this is going to be, very, very fast and very, very easy, because it's just simply not true. Embrace a message that says, hey, this is an amazing tool in the toolbox. And the question really is, pick your headache. Do you want the headache of sort of bringing the tool in, learning how to use the tool, training operators, dealing with the human component inside your facility? Or might it be easier to, especially at the start, to bring in the component and learn how to use the component, learn about delivery times and costs and durability and life cycle of the component itself before you sort of take that larger bite of the apple? Again, if you're sort of this sort of true manufacturing customer base. And so again, with additive, I think, be flexible, don't overextend yourself from a capital perspective, deliver real value in the form of a part. The part tells the truth, right? Like you said, Sean, the customer money is the honest money here. It'll tell the truth. If the customer pays for the part, the part's good. And so, your machine is good, your materials are good, your material handling is good, your inspection is good. All these are the things that have to be good in order to get a good part.
Yeah, I'll share. I think you nailed it. And I'll give you a real life, like current example. We have a customer, E9 has a customer where we are implementing a project for them, or did implement a project for them. And of course they were like, oh my, yeah, we're going to bring it all in-house, tee us up, show us how this works. Yep. Oh my gosh. Print some parts look great. We're bringing it in-house. They bring it in-house and the process works great when they had their, 5 engineers working on it. When they try to deploy it to manufacturing, all of a sudden results are not so consistent. And well, but it's the same machines and material and everything we had before. What happened? I thought it was used the analogy about Gandalf. I see people, it's like they want to rub the printer 3 times like a lamp, and then the part, the part genie comes out. So they come back to us and they're like, okay, guys, maybe we weren't quite as ready as we thought. We can absolutely run this with our engineering team. The problem is I can't keep 5 engineers tied up on this. We need these guys to go work on other things. And that's a really expensive production labor force. So B9, could you guys take this back and you guys make these parts? Because you can, do this way more cost effectively than we can. And when you talk about different applications, different hardware, the phrase that I began challenging our team with months ago, and I'm just beating this drum harder and harder, is when we talk to a customer, you've got to ask, the first question has to be, what's the best way to make this part?
Yeah.
Not, how do we lay it out? How do we orient it? Is this vat photopolymerization? Is this, none of those are the right questions. Just start with, what's the best way to make this part? And then how do we help the customer land on whatever that best way is? based on, and sometimes it's technical parameters, but a lot of times it's talent. How fast is their world changing? It's supply chain parameters. There's a whole bunch of other things that can drive those decisions. So I thought it was interesting. The very scenario that you laid out is one that are just in the process of helping a customer through. People, I will say, underestimate the complexity of integrating additive into their production toolbox. And
Yeah.
oftentimes, even if the printer, the material, and all that's pretty simple, they tend to neglect the downstream implications. Like, well, if we dual source this and some of these parts are additive and some aren't, does our customer support team need to be able to tell when they get a phone call from a customer whether that machine if the problem is with an additive component or one we made the old way? And if they do need to know, how are they going to tell? And does that mean we need to have different part numbers for one that has the additive stuff versus, and that's just one example of
Yeah.
some of the things that have to get thought through here and unfortunately are often neglected. The next question I want to ask you, and I'm trying to build a little bit on what you've shared, but when you think about those macro forces that are at work today, and you touched on a point that more and more companies are waking up to, like, hey, yeah, I can get this machine and the software from China, and I can buy this for $1,000, and it kind of does what looks like 80-90% of what this other machine over here does. And that boom, happened. We have customers now calling us saying, corporate told me I have to get all the Chinese made printers and software out of the building in 6 months. I need
Yep.
help.
Yep.
So given all those macro forces and that foreign actor, that's just one example, but acting on the additive industry, frankly, and its customers, and the fact that additive does have a legitimate place in the toolbox, both globally as well as domestically, what's the answer? If you're a company that needs to leverage additive to prepare yourself to thrive in this environment, how do you even begin to go about finding a solution, especially if you're not Ford or Nike or the U.S. Air Force that can throw several $1 million and 10
Yeah.
engineers at figuring this out. If I'm some
Yeah.
mid-market company that knows the world is changing around me faster and faster, I need to do this. What do you tell them? How do they do it?
It's a rapid analysis through a broad aperture that filters down quickly. What I mean by that is your rapid analysis has to be conducted from domestic sourced parts, or even I could say sort of MCA, Mexico, Canada, America Alliance parts. So, and parts here really is the kit, like the hardware, the materials. Those are the parts that we're talking about here. So what's the provisioning? What's the software provisioning? Where are the servers located? Once you actually start to look as a customer, at those questions, you can actually find the answers relatively quickly. You just got to ask the questions. You got to be pointed in your questions and sort of figure out what the true provisioning is of the digital side, the physical side, the material side, all of that. Once you ask those questions, what you're presented with is a very, very short list of potential vendors that have a supply base themselves and a manufacturing footprint which fall within this hemisphere. And so you have to ask the questions. You have to broad aperture and then narrow it very, very quickly, and you're left with like a handful, 3, 4, 5. That's it, that you can really look at to sort of have the right footprint and provisioning to be compliant with some of the new requirements. And I think the requirements are good requirements, honestly. I mean, when this comes from a guy, we had a trans-Pacific supply chain. We had, a lot of our stuff came out of China, and that used to be the way of the world, for so many things. And it was the way of the world for high spec things like, semiconductor platforms and, a flat panel display machines that would inspect, pixel by pixel. A lot of the expertise to build equipment like that doesn't even reside really, at least not largely in the US anymore, right? So you can talk about your components and you can talk about, the parts that go into the automobiles or the airplanes or whatever it is, but think about the robots. Who's making the robots, that make all that stuff? Whether the robot is, a 3D printer or whatever else, because that matters. I mean, these large state actors, in other hemispheres, man, they think in multi-decade timelines, and they don't have the inconvenience of rival political parties and the inconvenience of like, democratic, process. I mean, our process is a little messed up right now, but we still have, elections. We still have people that can have a vote. We still have a political party that in theory at least could change. And these overseas actors don't have to deal with any of those inconveniences, so they can lay out like multi-decade strategic plans to change the world in certain ways. And they deploy capital into certain strategic industries. You saw it with solar panels. You're seeing it with electric vehicles and battery storage. You're seeing it with additive manufacturing. You're seeing it with drones. These are sort of strategic industries. The point I simply make here, Sean, is there are some great companies in the United States, and there are tremendous companies that have locally sourced talent, incredibly creative and innovative, the American spirit of what is possible and what we can do here and what we can do quickly, and what we can do the right way without stealing somebody else's idea or stealing somebody else's IP. There are an amazing group of companies that are positioned to answer the call that the United States needs to have true supply chain independence, right? We had energy independence. Think about this. Think about like the energy sector, right? It used to be 20 years ago, everyone was like, oh, we've got to be energy independent from the Middle East. Well, it was hard, but we fracked our way out of that one and we got the energy that we needed, right? And now the United States is an energy exporter. If you sort of think about manufacturing, we could follow the same playbook actually and achieve true manufacturing industrial base independence. It's going to rely on us looking at the supply chain as it is, not as we wish it would be. Look at who builds the robots, like I said, what the human talent really is, and what can we actually deploy. But the American, landscape is ripe with amazing companies that are answering the call every day, choosing to do the hard thing. It's a form of patriotism. It's a form of service to their communities, to their employees, to their regions, and to the country. And those companies deserve to get great business and deserve to get the chance to deliver on the potential and deliver on that promise that Additive has. It really does. And in many cases, it is absolutely the right tool for the job. And it is the only tool for the job in many cases. And those cases need to be given a chance to shine. And that's what I could hope for the next 5 years.
Amen to that, brother. So, all that said, I want to circle back to the people piece of this.
Mhm.
You mentioned, obviously, in terms of our customer capabilities, company capabilities. Talk to me a little bit about the people part of the equation and where the talent is that we have, and I'm going to say domestically, versus the talent that we need for that next 5-year period.
Man, this is where I get a lot of optimism when I look at it. There are an incredibly, talented crop of young folk who are kind of looking at what they might want to do with their careers. And in some cases, they're saying, man, maybe biting off, student loans to the tune of six-figure, student debt. Maybe that's not for me. And man, I love that, because what you can do then is you can have a career as a young person building components or building parts, printing components. It's a tech career. You're using technology every single day. It's a very demanding job. It's a vital job, and it's a job that pays incredibly well. You can have a great family, a great life, a great, outcome, and you don't have to incur the debt and sort of like try to imagine that you need some college experience just purely for experience's sake. So I've got a lot of optimism now that finally this sort of, return to sort of like a focus on the industrial base and this sort of quote unquote American dynamism. We were actually doing that before it was cool, but like now there's this big emphasis on building back up the American manufacturing capability. If you look at the end of World War II, the River Rouge plant, at Ford Motor Company was turning out, strategic bombers at the rate of one per hour. One bomber an hour, and that's largely how the United States was able to kind of like come in and eventually turn the tide in the Pacific theater. And of course, previous to that in the Atlantic theaters, because we could produce planes one per hour. That's amazing. And we don't really have that ability anymore, but some of our near peer adversaries, they do. And so people in America care deeply for our way of life. Again, we may not agree and use the same language, left, right, center, whatever, on what that looks like, but I can guarantee that our way of life beats the alternative. We have an ability to have a voice. We have an ability to have governance by consent and not by decree. And that involves us putting our shoulder to the plow, so to speak, and doing the work. And there's a whole crop of young people and folks out there that actually want to do that. You're seeing people returning to farming. You're seeing people returning to ag businesses where there was a flight from that for a long time. Young people are waking up to where fulfillment in life can be found. And it's not in chasing the dollar. Chasing the dollar is not the thing. Chasing fulfillment in terms of delivering something that's real. That's the thing. Authenticity is the thing that matters. And when you're, going into a career and building a part, or you're delivering a solution for somebody, again, it could be a dental aligner, a hearing aid, an industrial part, whatever, you feel good about yourself at the end of every day. I help people with their teeth. I help people hear things they couldn't hear before. I helped a component go down an assembly line that went into a car. People are now driving and getting to work because of the work that I did. That's a great feeling day in, day out. And it's a sustaining and an enduring part of that American story because people can choose it. I swear people are forced into it. And that's terrible. But that's not what we have in the United States. That's the reason for hope and optimism, is like, man, people can choose it. And we you guys in the additive community, I'm the former additive community, you can help show them, hey guys, this is what it takes to print great parts. And we can do this together. Let's get on the bus. Let's drive forward. Let's make this happen. And I think we'll have the people problem addressed in those ways.
Well, I love that perspective. Blake, thank you so much. This has been
Yeah.
outstanding. And I think, some golden nuggets here from the perspective of somebody that, worked with the military, worked with industrial customers, trying to implement additive at scale, who's seen, the good, bad, and the ugly of the space and sees the potential that it offers, not just for customers, but ultimately, at the end of the day, it's about people.
Thanks for having me on the show. Glad you're doing this. I think it's important to get that voice of where we've been, where could we go? What's in the art of the possible here, but with a rational lens. The scars are painful, but if we don't learn from them as an industry and as leaders, what value did they provide us? Nothing, right?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Blake.
Wow, what a fantastic conversation. I feel like there was a lot to unpack there, and I'd love your thoughts on some of them. This first point, I feel like Blake made is a really strong case for starting with outcomes over equipment, whether it's an additive manufacturing process or a traditional manufacturing process.
He did a nice job of bringing that point out. I think this concept of starting with the question that we use so much at B9, what's the right way to make these parts, or what's the best way to make these parts? Being open that may be traditional, that may be additive, that may be some hybrid approach. And rather than coming at it with a technology first view, simply asking that question of what's the best way to make these parts, and then based on your choice, recognizing the downstream implications of whatever that choice is. Any of whether you're implementing a new traditional manufacturing technology or additive, adopting a new technology is challenging. And I think too often people think, well, additive, it adapts to my design. And, so complexity is free is the phrase that I hear so often. And to an extent in the design phase, but oftentimes that complexity does come back to have a cost associated in the downstream processing, things like cleaning a part that might be this, generative mesh that, yes, the printer can print that and it doesn't care that the shapes are complex. But when you go to clean or process that part, now all of a sudden that is more complex. And, his point about adopting new technology is hard. We can't disregard the elements of additive that go with that.
I think that's a great segue because he also was very clear that additive isn't magic. I'd love your perspective after your conversation with him on what do you feel like is the most commonly underestimated part of the system that causes these real world deployments to struggle?
Blake talked a little bit about, and certainly this is a conversation that we've heard from every guest we've had so far, that consistency and, not being able to hit the spec once, being able to hit the spec every time is vital. And many players in the industry today, the manufacturers of equipment and post-processing equipment, et cetera, haven't built it with consistency in the production environment in mind. And we had a conversation after the show ended, talking about how something as simple as a certificate of conformance on the printer, without that cornerstone, it's difficult to build a QA/QC foundation that lets the customer have confidence that these parts are going to be the same every time without doing some extremely complex and time-consuming 100% inspection. And he called that out, and given his time at Ascentium, they worked on a number of federal programs where standards were high, qualification was a challenge. And so Blake has a unique appreciation for how important that is to not only meet a qualification standard once, but be able to meet that again and again and again.
Something else, especially not only when you're dealing with federal work, but this hits corporations as well. It hasn't come up on the podcast, but it's come up in a lot of conversations I've had outside of it. This idea of where is your equipment made? Where is it manufactured? Where is the team? And we're starting to see this wave very directly in the federal area, but also pretty directly in a lot of corporate environments where you can't have Chinese additive ecosystems for a variety of reasons. What are the first questions you think people should be asking themselves when trying to figure out, man, what should I transition when to whom as they start to get this downstream regulation on themselves?
It's a great question. And there are the two lenses people tend to immediately jump to. One is simply everything has to say made in America. And certainly I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But I think if you took a step back and took the more pragmatic view, which is really more of a risk management view, and saying, what is my risk here? And treat it no differently than you would treat any other technology you were going to implement. And if you say, hey, all these printers run on the cloud, and the manufacturer pitches you that, you upload your design and you run the print, and the print gets smarter, or the printer gets smarter every time. Well, what are you uploading these designs into? And certainly any cloud connected piece of software that's sending your new R&D output to some questionable location is not a good idea. But I think there's also how do we get the best out of the system, whatever the system is? And by system, I don't just mean the printer, but this entire ecosystem or workflow, maybe is a better word. And who's going to be our partner to help us figure that out? The other thing in a manufacturing environment that I think people overlook is there's been this amazing proliferation of low-cost desktop type printers, and that's done some really good things for our industry. It has gotten companies exposed to what could we do with additive. The challenge is most of those machines are designed, it's something it's got a COGS of $200 so they can sell it to you for 900 and pay a distributor and make money, right? In the manufacturing world, I've never been in a plant where they assume that the production equipment has to get replaced every 30 days, right? And the R&D people will say, well, I don't care that it runs on a $1,000 printer and the LCD screen fades really fast. We'll just get a new one in 30 days and it's still cheaper than a different piece of equipment. Well, when it has no certificate of conformance, even if it did, does your plant manager want to be onboarding and offboarding production equipment every 30 days? I've never seen a manufacturing line designed around disposable production equipment. I'm not saying it can't be done, but the overhead drag and cost and time lost that goes along with that. Again, I talked about these two lenses, one being a pure, oh my gosh, what am I uploading my file into? But then there's this whole other risk management lens that I would encourage customers to think about. And again, you don't have to be an expert at 3D printing or additive manufacturing to grasp this. If you treat it like any other internet connected piece of technology, no differently than your copier, printer, thing that you have at the office, I guarantee you, if you engage your IT department, they will have some strong opinions around this as well. And it really is manageable if a customer will get somebody from IT. Yes, you probably need somebody from R&D, but somebody who can ask those risk management questions at the table. This is a solvable thing.
I smell an upcoming episode.
Yeah,
this smells like something that we're going to want to explore further.
I think you're right. And it's one of those, I will tell you, obviously, Danny, you live in this world, but it used to be you sold what I'll call the technical user, and then you had to sell the financial buyer to get one of these projects done. Increasingly, and it used to be at some point, somebody from IT might have to sign off on this. Increasingly, it is this IT risk management role is involved much earlier in the conversation, which I applaud, but it's not just, hey, yeah, later on you figure out how to make them happy. They've got to be satisfied with your approach to how you're going to integrate this, what it integrates to, what firewall it sits behind, can it operate in a dark site mode? So yes, I think we may even do something. Is there even a podcast where IT people get invited on? I don't know that there is.
This will be the first one. Open up your inboxes.
We might break that rule later, and IT people all over the world will cheer us, I think.
Yeah, there's a lot there. Something that was so cool, I thought Blake talked about that really just ended on this note of optimism is about workforce and giving, I'll use the word young people, a means to have fulfilling career paths, building things, doing things. And I thought it was so cool. And so I wanted to give you a chance to share your thoughts after having that conversation with Blake.
Yeah, I love it when you hear from someone who took the risk, made the leap, started a company. And for those of you who maybe don't know the whole story, I mean, Blake's wife was involved in that company as well. I mean, this was not I'm just a serial entrepreneur and this is just another thing. This was a very all-in personal thing for him and his family. And then, ended up, that company got acquired by another company, and now he's out doing it again. So many people, when you read what's going on today, what you hear is, oh, AI is eliminating jobs, and hiring dynamics are changing. Personally, I've got a daughter who's getting ready to graduate from college, and it's easy to see, oh my gosh, are the opportunities going to be there? Well, anytime there's disruption, opportunities are created. Status quo actually doesn't create opportunity, but the opportunity looks different. And even my son, who's a sales professional, he said, wow, AI is really changing how the company I work for does what they do. And he's, there's parts of it we had lunch yesterday. He said, there's parts of this I don't like. There's parts of this that I do like. And I just reminded him, which is challenging when you're 20, you can like it or not like it, but the change is happening. You're 20, you've got to figure out, how do I turn this into an opportunity? Whereas folks that look more like me from a gray hair perspective probably struggle with that. But the ability to make things in America, or I'll call it and I think Blake called it out too, but kind of North America, whether that's Mexico, Canada, friendly, more supply chain relevant proximity type location is greater today than I would argue than it's ever been. I'm not a history major, so if somebody wanted to debate me on the Industrial Revolution and maybe opportunity was greater then, but my theory is, certainly during that time period, a lot of equipment to make things didn't exist, and the people that had access to it were a very small number of people that had tremendous capital. Today, you can make things with equipment that doesn't require a ton of capital if you are willing to invest the time and energy in becoming an expert at leveraging that equipment. And that's another theme that Blake touched on that I think is so relevant is whether it's a hardware first model, a materials company, a software company, you can try and position yourself anywhere in that value chain. But if you want a part, somebody has to be an expert at running the equipment. Now that expertise might not have to sit within the customer organization. They may choose to outsource that, but somewhere somebody's going to have to be an expert at that. And those phrase I like to use, those cookies are on a low shelf today. When you look at what that equipment costs and the opportunities for our young folks to get exposed, whether through technical education, university education, or frankly, just going to work for a company who is doing that. When you think about foundries and casting and things like that, you're not going to have foundries scattered all over the country. There are companies making things all over the country using additive, and tremendous opportunity for people who might look and see that some of those paper pushing type jobs weren't going to be super fulfilling anyway. The good news is probably AI is going to do most of the paper pushing. Go work on something that's a lot more fun and have something concrete that you can see at the end of the day that's tangible. And we could do it. Maybe we will do another whole episode or probably a series of episodes on that. You and I both, Danny and I have conversations on the side about how many leaders of companies we talk to who are excited about what's happening. And, sometimes that positive opportunity oriented mindset isn't what grabs headlines because people love to just feed you the negative. Evidently, folks tend to click more on that, but that doesn't solve any problems. And we're going to get some problem solvers on here and talk about the great things that are ahead for both our country, but this next generation of workforce.
You can follow us on Apple or Spotify podcasts, and you can watch this episode on YouTube at the Additive Advantage Podcast. If you found value in today's conversation, a 5-star review on Apple or Spotify really helps us continue the show. Make sure you follow us on LinkedIn so you don't miss any episodes, and you can see all the show notes here. Thanks for spending time with us. We'll see you next time.